to go ahead and get started. I'll come a little closer since I didn't think to grab a microphone, but hopefully you can all. I have a PhD in musicology from KU, and I have been musicologist-in-residence for MCE for a while now. This afternoon, if you're joining us on the live stream or moment right now. He was nominated for an Oscar this year, and he was born in West Germany in 1966, but grew up in the UK. He recently told a German newspaper in an interview that at age 12 or 13, so in the late 70s, the local milkman introduced him to composers like Terry Riley, Philip Glass, and John Cage. Previously, he had thought of new music as Stravinsky. That was new enough for him. But instead, and I really enjoy imagining this conversation because how long has it been for any of a man or a mailman or delivery person or at age 40, the friend managing his writings ignored his wishes to have his remaining works destroyed. And the blue octavo notebooks were notebooks named for that they were indeed blue octavo notebooks that Kafka wrote in from 1917 to 1919. They mostly contain fragments, but include commentary on the human condition. Richter was inspired by these words and then explained that his album is, quote, a protest album about Iraq, a meditation on violence, both the violence I experienced around me as a child and the violence of war, at the utter futility of so much armed conflict. The album was recorded after a day of mass protests on February 15, 2003, when between 6 and 10 million people participated in protests across the world in up to 60 countries. Today's work comes from this album, as I mentioned, but has had many lives on screen. 2016 sci-fi film Arrival, Martin Scorsese's 2010 thriller Shutter Island, and more recently HBO's beloved series The Last of Us, and also last year's movie Hamnet, a historical drama about Shakespeare. It features, he wrote the entire score, but don't remember reading now if it was the director or Richter himself who just really felt that On the Nature of Daylight belonged in the pivotal moment of the film rather than a newly composed piece. So On the Nature of Daylight opens with the low strings presenting a long progression of chords. Eventually the second violin enters with a repetitive circling melody, and then the first violin adds the soaring long note melody above that to form this about 6.5-minute piece. Composer Jono Buchanan argues that the piece works so well for film music because, quote, it doesn't nail its emotional colors to the mast, so you can nail it to any mast you like, end quote. Similarly, critic Alex Ross, who I usually agree with, but don't necessarily in this case, Alex Ross says, quote, what troubles me about Richter's enterprise is, ultimately, its inoffensiveness. The music is passive, deferential, anonymous, end quote. And honestly, I'm really not sure there's anything wrong with that. We sometimes stake the claim that art with a capital A has to make some grand statement, but also remember that, keep in mind that Richter himself labeled this album a protest. And sometimes I really think that being still is itself a protest against the endless busyness and scrolling of 21st century life. So if you enjoy this piece, I mentioned in the program notes about Richter's album Sleep that's been very popular on streaming services, or you could also check out, he has a project that's a recomposition of Vivaldi's Four Seasons using techniques like phrasing and looping. So familiar but different piece of his that you can find streaming as well. So switching gears, we'll talk about the last piece on the program next. The final work is by Alexander Borodin, who is kind of a unique character among the remembered names of music history, but in some ways is much more relatable to the average musician who maybe just plays for fun instead of making it their full-time job. So Borodin's origin story is complicated. His parents were having an affair, and as an illegitimate child, he had to be registered as the son of one of his father's serfs. Serfdom was a form of slavery, essentially, in Russia, beginning in the 17th century. Serfs were originally attached to the land upon which they lived and would be sold along with the land when it was sold. But by the 19th century, that attachment was no longer a requirement. Borodin was born in 1833, and serfdom was not abolished until 1861. Serfs were not able to attend school, and this withholding of education would be a serious problem after emancipation. Young Borodin, however, was lucky to be a serf in name only. His father provided a large house in St. Petersburg for he and his mother to live. Although Borodin did call his mother his aunt, she was never able to recognize him publicly as her son. So as a serf, though, he wasn't able to attend school, but he was well educated by private tutors and entered medical school in 1850 and then pursued a career in chemistry, eventually becoming a professor at the same medical school he had attended. I decided to not even try to understand the discovery that made his career. It has something to do with organic chemistry and carbon bonds, and I think it's used in the production of some medications, but I couldn't swear to it. I need to have one of my pre-med students that I advise explain it to me, tell me what on earth it all means. But music, though, was a big part of Borodin's education, as he showed an early aptitude for music. His nurse would take him to watch the regimental band at the local parade grounds in St. Petersburg, and Borodin would come home and pick out the tunes on the piano. His mother then hired a soldier from the band to give Borodin flute lessons, and he was soon joined by a child in a family who boarded with them, a child named Mikhail, who became a lifelong friend. Soon the boys began piano lessons and eventually began playing four-hand arrangements of symphonies by Haydn, Beethoven, and Mendelssohn. The boys taught themselves string instruments, Mikhail the violin and Borodin the cello. Borodin played the cello throughout his life. It was, as many of us have experienced, an excellent way to unwind from his otherwise demanding career. He had one postdoctoral position in Heidelberg and another in Pisa, and he traveled to Paris and other cities, meeting musicians and enjoying concerts and playing chamber music in his spare time everywhere he went. In 1861 in Heidelberg, he met a Russian pianist, Ekaterina Protopoprova, who was there being treated for tuberculosis. She recovered and introduced Borodin to the music of Chopin and the Schumanns, and they were engaged just a few months later. Borodin wrote music for her, as well as more chamber music that he had been composing all along. The two returned to Russia in 1862, and it was then that Borodin met Balakirev, a composer, pianist, and conductor a few years younger than him. Balakirev is mostly remembered today for his promotion of musical nationalism and encouragement of other composers like Glinka, Tchaikovsky, as well as a group that became known as the Five, or the Mighty Handful, which was Balakirev, Borodin, Cesar Cui, Modest Mussorgsky, and Nikolai Ridsky-Korsakov. Balakirev promoted a Russian school free of influence from Southern and Western Europe, and Borodin's tone poem In the Steppes of Central Asia, which is probably his most well-known orchestral work, does fit that nationalist mold. This afternoon's quartet, however, does not fit that Russian nationalist theme. It's significant for Borodin's adherence to traditional forms of European classical music, particularly sonata form, which forms all four movements of the quartet, which is a bit unusual to have a composer that dedicated to one form through the whole piece. Balakirev had thought that it wasn't even worth composing chamber music at all, believing that Beethoven and Schumann had taken the genre as far as it would go. But perhaps because Borodin spent so much time playing and composing chamber music rather than orchestral works, he stuck with it. Borodin composed this quartet unusually quickly in August 1881, the same year as in the steppes of Central Asia, and dedicated it to his wife, possibly for their 20th anniversary. Some scholars argue that although Borodin did not publish a program with the work as he did with some others, it represents their meeting and courtship in Heidelberg. What we know for sure, though, is that Borodin shows his technical skill of contrapuntal and formal writing. The cello begins the first theme of the first movement in an unusually high register and is quickly echoed by the violin. These two instruments seem to represent Borodin and his wife. One description I read labeled this movement as a beguiling discourse between the instruments, and I really like that. A sonata form features a statement of a theme and a contrasting theme, then those are developed together and then restated at the end. And at the end of this first movement, a lovely coda speeds up and relaxes again with the viola providing winding chromatic notes in the middle, and then the cello one last arpeggio before the closing chords. Just kind of makes you go, The second movement is a scherzo that I think sounds a bit Mendelssohnian as it dances along at first, but the second theme settles into a more waltz-like character. Another example of sonata form where we might normally expect an ABA, scherzo, trio, scherzo form. A little bit of trivia for you too. One of the themes of this movement is featured in a Tony Award-winning musical from 1954 called Kismet, if anyone happens to have seen that. Much of the music from that musical is Borodin's. The third movement is probably the most well-known. You may hear it and think, that sounds a little familiar, if you haven't heard this whole piece before. It again features a beautiful melody in the high register of the cello, and about 20 measures later, the violin takes the same melody in its own high register. So listen for those moments later in the movement when the cello and violin play the theme in much closer dialogue, almost measure by measure. The fourth movement opens with a slow introduction that again seems to represent dialogue, this time started by the violins and answered by the viola and cello. This material provides Borodin most of what he needs for the rest of the movement, which is again another sonata form. He expands, contracts, modulates, uses all the tools in his composer toolbox to create an expansive movement out of those opening notes. This might be a stretch, but perhaps this movement uses Borodin's mastery of compositional rules to reflect the insight gained after 20 years of marriage. I don't know, but feel free to see what kind of program you can come up with while listening to this quartet. The work had its premiere in early 1882 at the Russian Music Society in St. Petersburg, and sadly it was the last work that Borodin completed. Borodin called himself a Sunday composer, and presumably his full-time job kept him quite busy up until his sudden death from heart failure in 1887. I really hope you enjoy this work, especially if it is one you haven't heard before, and as I mentioned, keep an ear out for the dialogue throughout, and let me know if you come up with a good program for it. So now we'll step back just a few more decades and one final example of words and music. Felix Mendelssohn wrote a song in June 1827 on a poem he probably wrote himself, although he gives a pseudonym for the poet in the sheet music. The words translate, and these are in your program notes as well, so you don't have to memorize it, but the poem goes, "Is it true that you always wait for me there in the leafy path by the grape arbor and ask the moonlight and the little stars about me? Is it true? What I feel can only be understood by someone who feels it with me and who will stay forever true to me." Mendelssohn was 18 years old, and less than 2 months earlier, he had experienced the failure of his first opera, Camacho's Wedding, a Singspiel based on a scene from Don Quixote. Mendelssohn had started it a few years earlier and certainly worked hard to make it ready for performance, but rehearsals did not go very well, and the premiere went so badly that Mendelssohn himself left before the second act even started. The press panned it, and Mendelssohn canceled all future performances. It's of course hard to say if this experience had any direct influence on Mendelssohn's state of mind when he wrote this song, but it had to be extremely frustrating. A few months after composing it, Mendelssohn used this song as the basis for his first mature string quartet, and we know that because not only did the notes align, but he published the song along with the quartet, and wrote to a friend about it as well. So let's hear this song, because if Mendelssohn included it with the score, he wanted at least the players to hear it, keeping in mind that string quartets were as much for personal enjoyment as for concerts back when they were first composed. So I want to thank Michael, our violinist, and my favorite pianist in the city, Melody Stroth, playing as well, just to play the song for us. So this is Mendelssohn's Frage. We might originally hear it at the end one more time, but I'm running us short on time. I've had a lot to say today, so thank you so much. So you'll hear especially those first few notes, not right at the opening of the first movement, but the slow introduction starts elsewhere and then ends kind of with those opening notes. And then later he uses, there's a phrase about 2/3 of the way through that he uses directly in the first theme and then builds the sonata form from there. The second movement features a beautiful slow introduction as well. It's major key, very peaceful, and then gives way to something different. So that requires us to back up again for a moment. I mentioned in the program notes that Beethoven's late string quartets were very influential for Mendelssohn. These were his last completed compositions from 1825 and 1826. Beethoven died in 1827. 3 of the quartets were commissioned by a Russian aristocrat, and then the last 3 Beethoven wrote without a commission because apparently he was enjoying himself. He had last written string quartets more than a dozen years earlier, and in the meantime he had composed huge works, the Ninth Symphony, Missa Solemnis, and he was also completely deaf by this time, of course. These quartets are more complex motivically, contrapuntally, harmonically, and are of longer length than most chamber music that preceded it. Early reviews called them incomprehensible and an indecipherable horror. Some simply dismissed them because Beethoven was deaf. But Mendelssohn, though, didn't agree, and of course eventually most people came around to Mendelssohn's way of seeing these quartets. Because they were completed and published so close to and some after Beethoven's death, it's unclear which ones Mendelssohn might have had access to, as he was composing this quartet just a year later. But there are clear influences. So for example, going back to the second movement of the quartet, I mentioned a beautiful slow introduction, but then the viola introduces a fugue with a thorny chromatic subject. Fugue being a compositional tool that basically means a subject is presented and then imitated and manipulated in other voices. So again, lots of imitation, not unlike the dialogue from Borodin. There's a lot of imitation on today's concert too. That could have been an alternative theme. But anyway, Mendelssohn makes it a little weird by giving the fugue subject an odd length. The next voice comes in at a time that, if you're familiar with fugues, feels a little odd, but it's kind of a Beethoven thing. And later, Mendelssohn puts the slow introduction and the fugue back together in an interesting way. It's a long movement, and one takeaway, like I said, can be just to notice all the imitation happening as different voices pass around small motives. The third movement is so Mendelssohnian, though. The year before composing this quartet, so 1826, Mendelssohn had completed his overture to Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, which would become perhaps his most famous work. including the incidental music for the play, including the wedding march that he wrote much later in his career. I can say from my own research into 19th century St. Louis that this music was very popular. A visiting orchestra in the 1850s played it frequently, and when St. Louis's own orchestras eventually were accomplished enough, they played Midsummer Night's Dream frequently as well. So all that to say, the third movement starts out as a gentle nocturne with the first violin carrying the melody, and then the viola leads us off in another fast, imitative section that reminds me of Midsummer Night's Dreams, like shimmering fairies floating around. The nocturne does make one more appearance, but the fairies win out in the end, bringing the movement to a quiet but still exciting conclusion. This sets up a great contrast with the dramatic opening to the fourth movement that is again a sign of Beethoven's influence, but perhaps also Mendelssohn's recent operatic experiments. The lower strings tremolo dramatically, while the first violin seems to perform an aria. Mendelssohn then uses the rest of the movement to tie the whole work together, using the main theme from the first movement, the fugue from the second movement, but it's in duple meter instead of triple, and eventually he brings us back to the song that inspired the whole quartet at the very end of the movement. So if you can still hold on to a bit of what that song sounded like, you'll hear it at the very, very end. So I think I'm about out of time. If there are any questions, I am happy to answer, but I hope you really enjoy this concert today. It's really going to be a treat. So I thank you so much.